they'll be here, some of the guys I saw.
I will start. A quorum being present, the subcommittee will come to order. I'd like to now recognize myself for an opening statement. The Organization of American States, or OAS, is the oldest multilateral regional organization in the world. As Secretary Tillerson recalled in his remarks earlier this month, the precursor to today's OAS began with the first international conference of American states in 1889, hosted by the United States. By the way, I was not part of that conference. We and 20 American states are signatories to the OAS, which was chartered in 1948. The Inter-American Democratic Charter adopted in Lima on September 11, 2001, on the very day that the U.S. was brutally attacked, was a unified response by our neighbors that tyranny will not win. Article 1 of the Inter-American Democratic Charter affirms that the peoples of the Americas have a right to democracy, and that governments have an obligation to promote and defend it. This is the underlying reason for the existence of the OAS, and is a vision that we share with our Latin American and Caribbean partners. Excuse me. Yet today the OAS is composed of 35 nations in the Americas, the member states of an organization devoted to promoting democracy, welcomed the communist Cuban regime back into its membership in 2009, and has so far prevented the suspension of the Venezuelan dictatorship that has wreaked havoc on its people and sent hundreds of thousands of refugees to neighboring countries, all for some preferential financing and subsidized oil. OAS Secretary General Almagro has shown leadership in fighting for the Venezuelan people to reclaim their country, as has Peruvian President Kaczynski in yesterday's decision to rescind the invitation to Venezuela to attend April's Summit of the Americas, a bold action in defense of democracy and human rights. Today, we meet to consider the role of the OAS and other inter-American organizations, such as the Pan American Health Organization, the Inter-American Institute for Cooperation on Agriculture, and the Pan American Institute of Geography and History, towards advancing U.S. interests in the region. U.S. assessed contributions to these organizations is nearly 60% of their budgets, and the American people have an interest in knowing why we contribute money if U.S. investments have achieved results, and if there are areas for reform. Following years of advocacy from the Foreign Affairs Committee for the OAS to appoint a secretary to the multidimensional security and a new inspector general, I commend Secretary General Almagro for filling these key positions. Conversely, the Government Accounting Office recently found that the U.S. faces challenges in tracking results for aid to inter-American organizations, and the U.S. may have difficulty complying with the 2013 Organization of American States Revitalization and Reform Act, which prioritized quota reforms in the OAS so that no member state pays more than 50% of the OAS's assessed fees. The next OAS General Assembly meeting occurs in June. I believe this is the time to address this issue if the OAS is ever going to move forward to address its financial deficit. The U.S. should no longer shoulder the uneven financial responsibilities when half of the OAS member states had quotas below $100,000 and quotas for 26 member states equaled less than 1%. Today, the OAS has an $80 million budget and 4 objectives: promoting democracy, human rights, development, and regional security. OAS electoral missions play critical roles in safeguarding the electoral process in the hemisphere. And this year, 10 countries have requested OAS observation missions. This is no small thing when the region will be holding 6 presidential elections, and regional confidence in democracy is at an all-time low. The OAS political missions, like the OAS mission against corruption and impunity in Honduras, assist countries with important anti-corruption efforts. The OAS Inter-American Committee Against Terrorism and Cybersecurity program prioritizes cybersecurity and terrorism finance prevention efforts. Yet for all these efforts, some say that OAS is overstretched and underfunded, lacking clarity about its missions. Others laud the efforts by the OAS Inter-American Commission on Human Rights and Inter-American Court on Human Rights, but question whether these entities respect the members' states' sovereignty and domestic rule of law. In addition, the Inter-American organization I mentioned earlier all receive U.S. funding, and these entities support work that is significant to many member states. However, some have raised concerns about these efforts, along with OAS efforts related to scholarships that lead to overreaching mandates and siphon away resources from other critical priorities. There may be ways to modernize these priorities to achieve greater cost savings through other entities or the Inter-American Development Bank. I want to take a moment to note that the U.S. is a 30% shareholder of the bank, and the bank's initial selection to host the IDB, International Development Bank's 60th anniversary meeting is unacceptable for the U.S. and others that want to see greater private sector investment and transparent government in the Americas. In conclusion, the Trump administration has named this year the Year of the Americas, and I believe the U.S. has a vital role to play in leading efforts to modernize the OAS, which definitely needs a new IT system, for instance, and ensuring that U.S. support for the OAS and inter-American organizations support U.S. interests. To do so, the United States mission of the OAS needs an ambassador and a cohesive strategy. I urge my Senate colleagues to move quickly to confirm President Trump's nominee, Carlos Trujillo. With that, I turn to the ranking member for his opening remarks. Sir.
Hey, good afternoon. Thank you to our chairman for holding this timely hearing, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today. The Organization of American States has been a tool to bring democratic members of the Western Hemisphere together since 1948. This inter-American system has served as a forum where the U.S. can work with its neighbors to strengthen the hemisphere, while advancing our strategic interest. Its 4 objectives are democracy promotion, human rights protection, economic and social development, and regional security cooperation. The OAS has been able to convene actors to perform important duties such as election observation, hearings on human rights violations, and the promotion and protection of free press. Unfortunately, though the OAS has stalled when it has come to taking concrete actions to hold bad actors in the region accountable. It is clear that there are management issues, an antiquated payment system, structural inefficiency, and budgetary problems that have plagued the organization and weakened the institution. The OAS ends up needing ad hoc contributions and volunteer contributions to fund its programs rather than rely on its annual budget. Additionally, a coordinated and steadfast campaign led by Venezuela's regime to cripple the organization and grind its productivity to a screeching halt has only made matters worse. Adding insult to injury, the Trump administration has shown little regard for multilateral institutions and continues to either alienate or retreat from every relationship the U.S. has spent centuries investing in. The humanitarian, political, and economic crisis in Venezuela getting worse with each day that passes. Daniel Ortega and his cronies consolidating power, and Evo Morales in Bolivia already announcing that he will find a way to make his fourth term in office a reality. It is more important than ever that the regional body dedicated to promoting democracy and standing for human rights should be operating at full steam. Under Chairman Cook's leadership, our subcommittee has already examined several elections taking place in 2018 and protected the integrity of these elections. Promoting democracy and protecting human rights need to remain a top priority. I am eager to hear from our panel on how we can improve engagement with the OAS and better enable them to be the leader in the region. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman. Before I recognize you to provide your testimony, I'm going to explain the lighting system in front of you. Actually, this is a statement for me that the staff puts in there, so I won't screw this up. You each have 5 minutes to present your oral argument. When you begin, the light will turn green. When you have a minute left, the light will turn yellow. And when your time has expired, the light will turn red. I ask that you conclude your testimony once the red light comes on, or you might hear a little tap, tap, tap. And it's not Edgar Allan Poe and the Raven, it's just me. After our witnesses testify, members will have 5 minutes to ask questions. I urge my colleagues to stick to the 5-minute rule to ensure that all members get the opportunity to ask questions. Our first witness to testify will be Mr. Thomas Melito, the Director of International Affairs and Trade at the United States Government Accountability Office, the GAO. Mr. Melito has been at GAO for more than 29 years. Wow. And in his capacity, he is primarily responsible for GAO's humanitarian assistance and multilateral portfolio. Our second witness to testify is Mr. Alfonso Aguilar, the president for the International Human Rights Group, which seeks to defend and protect political rights, religious freedom, and the dignity of the human person through the Inter-American System of Human Rights. Previously, Mr. Aguilar was the former chief of the U.S. Office of Citizenship and served in numerous high-level government positions in the Bush administrations and the government of Puerto Rico. He is also a well-known policy and political analyst. Our last witness to testify will be Mr. Peter Quilter, the former Secretary for the Administration of Finance at the Organization of American States. Most recently, he spent 2 years as a senior fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School Ash Center for Democratic Governance, where he endured the snows of the Northeast. And before the OAS, he advised the House Foreign Affairs Committee ranking member Eliot Engel on the Americas. He also served at the State Department under President Clinton. Mr. Melito, you are recognized. Thank you.
Chairman Cook, Ranking Member Series, and members of the subcommittee, I am pleased to be here to discuss our work regarding U.S. assistance to inter-American organizations. The United States belongs to several inter-American organizations that, among other things, promote democracy, security, healthcare, agricultural development, and scientific exchange in the Western Hemisphere. These organizations include the Organization of American States, the Pan-American Health Organization, the Inter-American Institute for Cooperation on Agriculture, and the Pan-American Institute of Geography and History. The United States uses its membership in these organizations to promote U.S. interests in the Western Hemisphere. My testimony today summarizes the findings from our June 2017 and December 2017 reports on U.S. assistance to inter-American organizations. This testimony addresses 3 topics. First, U.S. assessed contributions to the four organizations. Second, the extent to which the organization's strategic goals align with those of U.S. agencies. And third, the extent to which U.S. agencies included and documented key monitoring provisions as part of their assistance agreements. Regarding the first topic, state provides the United States assessed contributions to these four organizations' regular budgets. For calendar year 2016, the United States assessed contributions to these four organizations totaled over $130 million and represented more than 50% of each organization's budget. In October 2013, the U.S. enacted the Organization of American States Revitalization and Reform Act. The Reform Act directed the Secretary of State to submit a multi-year strategy that establishes that no member state pays more than 50% of the OAS's assessed fees. Any change to OAS assessed fees will also be reflected in U.S. contributions to the other three organizations. We found that the U.S. share of assessed contributions to the four organizations may be reduced in the future. In 2014, states submitted to Congress a strategy for reducing U.S. assessed contributions below 50%. In 2017, state officials informed us that they worked with other OAS member states, including Canada and Mexico, to explore quota reform options. Soon after publication of our June 2017 report, OAS member states voted to draft a proposal to modify the quota structure to potentially reduce the maximum assessed contribution to below 50%. According to state officials, the modification to the quota structure, if approved, will be gradual and would not be implemented until 2019 at the earliest. Regarding our second topic, we found that the strategic goals of the four inter-American organizations are predominantly aligned with the high-level strategic goals for the Western Hemisphere documented by state, USAID, HHS, and USDA. According to officials, the agencies all consider U.S. strategic goals when deciding which projects to fund at the four organizations. U.S. agencies, on an ongoing basis, evaluate each inter-American organization to ensure U.S. and organization goals are aligned. For example, according to USAID officials, its assistance policies and procedures ensure that all USAID-funded activities are linked to applicable U.S. and agency strategies. Regarding the third topic, state, HHS, USAID, and USDA fund activities at three of their organizations in the form of assistance agreements such as grants and cooperative agreements. In our December 2017 report, we reviewed 12 such agreements across the four U.S. agencies and found that state and USDA did not include all key monitoring provisions in their agreements as called for by applicable guidance. State has taken corrective actions since the grants were awarded. We also found that all four agencies did not have full documentation of the activities required by the 12 assistance agreements we reviewed. State and HHS both initiated corrective actions prior to our review. Monitoring the implementation of U.S. assistance agreements and fully documenting the results of such monitoring are key management controls to help ensure that U.S. agreement recipients use federal funds appropriately and effectively. In our December 2017 report, we recommended that USDA ensure inclusion of all monitoring provisions as part of their agreements, and two, USAID and USDA ensure full documentation of monitoring activities. The agencies concurred with these recommendations and indicated they will take actions to address them. Chairman Cook, Ranking Member Series, and members of the subcommittee, this concludes my prepared statement. I'll be pleased to answer any questions you may have at this time.
Thank you very much. I must say, you were right on the second. I wish I could do that. Mr. Aguilar, you are now recognized.
Chairman Cook, Ranking Member Sears, members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to be part of this afternoon's hearing. From the outset, I'd like to state my strong belief that a strong OAS is needed to protect democracy and human rights in the region. Yet, we must recognize that the relevance of the OAS has been seriously diminished. For the last 20 years, as left-leaning autocratic regimes have taken hold in countries like Venezuela, Bolivia, and Nicaragua, manipulating elections, overturning the existing constitutional order, and violating fundamental political and human rights, the OAS hasn't been able to take any meaningful action It is important, therefore, that we ask what has led to this situation and what the U.S. can do to turn things around at the OAS. First, we must understand that the basic structure of the OAS, as established in its charter and its consensus approach to decision-making, inherently limits and slows down the ability for the organization to act swiftly or at all. It's very easy for a significant minority of countries to prevent the organization from taking action on important matters. A good example of this is the case of Venezuela. A small coalition of nations ideologically aligned with Venezuela, which includes countries like Bolivia, Ecuador, and Nicaragua, with the support of the small but numerous island states of the Caribbean, has prevented the deteriorating situation in the country from being properly addressed by the organization. The OAS hasn't been able to pass a resolution to denounce the abuses of the Maduro regime. This obstructionism, however, has generally prevailed due to the leadership vacuum at the OAS left by the U.S. The U.S. today seems to have lost interest in the OAS and is not exerting adequate and proper leadership in the organization. The OAS needs strong leadership from the largest and oldest democracy in the hemisphere. It's not about being heavy-handed or trying to impose our way. It's about regularly and consistently playing a leadership role to try to forge the necessary consensus to make the organization work. Furthermore, the continuous new mandates and initiatives the organization takes up, as well as the overly broad strategic goal of promoting development in the region, may also distract the organization from properly addressing the regional challenges to democracy and human rights. The OAS manages projects and technical assistance programs on a wide array of issues. Many experts argue that these initiatives are well beyond the organization's expertise and human and financial resources, and could be better managed by a multilateral agency like the Inter-American Development Bank. Turning now to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights and the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, I should say that something quite different is happening with these bodies. These forums are affiliated to the OAS, but they're autonomous and act independently of member states. Both the Commission and Court have actually acted swiftly to condemn attacks to democracy and human rights in the region. The Commission has issued important reports and precautionary measures on human rights violations in Bolivia, Ecuador, and Venezuela. And the Court has issued strong sentences against rulings from Venezuelan courts controlled by the regime which violate the fundamental rights of its citizens. The problem, however, with these bodies is that they're compromising their credibility by often weighing in on a myriad of issues that go beyond their mandate under treaty law and that are of the internal jurisdiction of member states. The Commission recently questioned the U.S. government's decision to end temporary protected status for nationals from certain countries, calling on this Congress to provide them with legal status. In 2011, the Commission requested the government of Brazil to halt work on a hydroelectric plant until it addressed concerns from indigenous communities. The Brazilian government responded by suspending relations with the Commission, as well as its funding to it, calling the request precipitous and unwarranted. The Court, for its part, has been issuing rulings and opinions not based on the text of the American Convention of Human Rights. Just last month, without any basis on the actual text of the Convention, the Court issued an advisory opinion instructing member states to recognize same-sex marriage and gender identity. These intermissions in the internal affairs of member states have understandably caused great concern in the countries of the region and are perceived as an attempt against their sovereignty and constitutional order. The recent Court's advisory opinion, same-sex marriage, became the principal issue in the general elections in Costa Rica, propelling the victory in the first round of the presidential election of a candidate of a small party who promised to withdraw Costa Rica from the court. In the case of the courts which were not under its jurisdiction, the U.S. could demand that none of our funds are used to finance the court until it goes back to working within the legal mandate and framework under which it was created. I thank you for the opportunity to testify on this important issue. I will be happy to answer the questions that you may have.
Thank you very much, sir. Mr. Coulter, you are now recognized.
Chairman Cook, Ranking Member Sears, members of the distinguished subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to return to testify today, this time on the OAS, its place in the foreign policy options of the United States, and its place in the region. I'm not going to tell you that the organization is the premier forum for dialogue. I'm not going to tell you it's the oldest regional organization around. I'm not going to tell you that it's the only multilateral game in town, mostly because the two of you just told us that, and you know it. What I will say is that we need it now more than ever. And by we, I mean the United States. Let me describe the neighborhood as I see it right now. Venezuela is swirling down an economic and political drain. Brazil and Peru are grappling with epic levels of corruption in their political classes. Hondurans appear stuck with the results of an election most observers agree was stolen. The Caribbean area is struggling with the increasingly dire consequences of climate change. And the Northern Triangle countries of Central America are being strangled by violence, drugs, and economic distress, with the attendant destabilizing consequences on migration flows. Now let me describe the U.S. relationship to this region right now. Secretary Tillerson just returned from his second trip to the neighborhood, intended basically to manage feelings of deep unease. Why? President Trump. Here are the highlights. He's pulled the U.S. out of the TPP. Obviously, several Latin American countries are part of it. He's threatened to exit from NAFTA, calling it the worst trade deal in history, with untold consequences for the economies of both Mexico and Canada, to say nothing of the U.S. itself. He has weaponized the immigration issue, which of course has special resonance for Latin Americans, and specifically targeted 200,000 immigrants here by ending TPS. This month, he appeared to threaten to cut off counter-narcotics aid to our strongest allies in the counter-narcotics effort. His budget, released Monday, appears to bear this out. And then there's the wall. The Gallup organization has placed the approval of the United States and its president in this region in 2017 at 16%, 1-6. As someone else said, there are 6 elections in 2018 coming in this region, all of which are very important. The U.S. faces an unprecedented challenge, and it faces it now. It needs a strong and functional multilateral forum to meet that challenge. Multilateralism in this context is the OAS. In my written testimony, I have a longer series of recommendations for action, but I'm going to highlight a few. The financial plight of the organization. I will say this because Secretary Generals don't like to say it. The OAS is operating today in the context of a full-blown financial crisis. It is down 23% in its budget in real terms in the past 10 years. There is nothing left to cut. I was the guy who was trying to cut things for a couple of years. There is nothing left to cut. So they cut the staff. It's very easy to see that over time that will destroy the organization. Second, the OAS is a creature of foreign ministries, not presidents. Effectively, that's creating a political ceiling for the organization. We need to get it out from under the foreign ministries. I think the way to do that is to tie it more directly with the summit process so that they formally answer to the presidents. And you should know that Venezuela is the implacable foe of that idea, and there's a reason why. Number 3, the buildings. It's a pet peeve of mine. We know that the buildings, like the beautiful one on 17th Street, are in fact falling apart. They look beautiful, but they're falling apart. The OAS is carrying $30 million in deferred maintenance, and they've been carrying it for years. The longer you don't maintain, the more expensive it gets. I believe the U.S. has a special responsibility because we are the host country. Number 4, the Secretary General should have one single term. Secretary General Almagro has said he will be a one-term Secretary General. I give him a lot of credit for that. It has bolstered him politically. I believe the OAS should institutionalize that. No re-election. Summarizing, yes, concerted action is needed. Resources are needed in order to stand this organization back up. It is also likely that we will need some sort of action-forcing event. I think it's distinctly possible that the action-forcing event will be the fall of the Maduro government in Venezuela. That's going to happen. When it happens, Venezuela will need all the help it can get. The OAS will be the go-to organization. It needs to be strong, and it needs to be ready. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will yield myself 5 minutes for questions. Um, You know, listening to this, a lot of great points were raised there. And just to let you gentlemen know, I'm also on the NATO Parliament, and I felt like, oh, wait a minute, I'm at a NATO meeting right now. We're all going to try and agree on 29 countries where we're going, plus the other ones. It's very, very difficult when you have these multilateral groups in getting a consensus. And part of the reason we're doing this is, I think, we're looking for direction, or maybe the words from the experts. And I don't know if we can ever get there, simply because of the complexity and the number of countries that are involved in the issues. I do agree that if we get down there in the weeds too much and we start lecturing or sermonizing certain countries about what is in their country there, I think we run the risk of countries just saying, we don't need this stuff anymore. They want to be part of this. They want to work together. And I'm looking for solutions, and obviously on how we can simplify this, where maybe we can at least have a new action plan to simplify this. Obviously, we don't even have our agencies that are working together, let alone the countries, and it's going to impact on the budget and where we go, so that our missions, what we want to accomplish, are simple. It's too important an organization to screw up. And so we're having this hearing today. We'll probably have more on this. How we, and whether we can solve this problem in the future. I think we're just one of many. But if this thing blows up, it's like NATO blowing up the UN. I can go on and on and on. Yeah, there's always going to be faults to this. But I think if we don't meet and we don't get together, but I think we got to keep our topics very general, try and get a buy-in, a consensus as much as possible, so we can attack some of these things. And with that consensus, maybe we can get better funding for it. Any comments on my diatribe? Left you speechless.
Again, back to my statement, I agree with you, but that requires a high-level commitment from the administration and from future administrations to be actively involved in the OAS. I'm not the only one saying this. There's many experts that say that for the past 15 to 20 years, the U.S. hasn't been present, actively engaged. I think if we are involved in the process of high-level diplomacy at the OAS and the region, we may be able to forge the coalitions to be able to pass resolutions. For example, a resolution denouncing Venezuela. I think we've had an issue with the Caribbean countries. I think if we engage the Caribbean countries in a conversation to see how they can support us at the OAS, we may be able to create a consensus. I don't think that's happening. I think we're present there, but I don't think we're...
Well, I agree with you, and I made this comment when I first took over this committee, that we've kind of ignored the region for a variety of reasons. And it shows, just like we're flip-flopping, whether it was Europe or whether it was the Far East or China. But I think because of all the issues that we've talked about, the number of countries, it's just too important to the United States to ignore. And how we do that, and I think is going to be very, very difficult. A lot of us have been on different committees and everything else, and it's easy to say one thing, and then when you get together, hammering out a consensus. But I want to turn it over to Mr. Sears. You are now recognized.
Thank you, Chairman. You know, over the years, I've been very critical of the OAS. Critical because, in reality, you know, they never spoke up about human rights abuses anywhere. I thought they were controlled by just a few countries, you know, which I think manage the OAS for their benefits. And we're seeing it today with Venezuela, where Venezuela is, blocking anything that the OAS wants to do. They get together with a couple of countries, and to me, it's like an organization that, where's its usefulness? And can anybody tell me what is the most effective part of the OAS, besides the guy living over here in Washington, D.C.? In a nice house.
If I certainly agree that the United States has been punching below its weight in the organization for a very long time. It might be enough to say that we haven't had an ambassador there since 2014. So I agree with Mr. Aguilar that the U.S. needs to take a good hard look at why it's not punching at its weight. I would also agree with you that Venezuela is punching above its weight. They've put a lot of resources into their presence in the OAS. I mean, the guy who was ambassador for the very, very longest time was the senior diplomat in the United States in any organization, including to the White House or to the UN. They put him at the OAS. So they knew the game they were playing, and the U.S. was apparently playing a different game. I think that's right.
I just want to point out that in April of 2017, Venezuela indicated it's pulling out of the OAS, but it will take up to 2 years for that to be finalized. So they could change things.
Well, two quick points. First of all, I think in terms of our government, there's an over-reliance on the Secretary General. And I commend Secretary Almagro for speaking up. It's consistent with his additional duties on the Inter-American Democratic Charter. But that's not enough if there is no collective action from the organization. My second point is, in terms of bodies that are effective, I would argue that the Commission and the Court are effective when it comes to singling out violations of political rights, of freedom of the press in those left-leaning countries. Those countries have actually complained and have blasted the Commission and the Court. My concern is that those bodies that can be very effective are compromising their credibility when they're getting involved in issues for which they don't have a mandate. And this is a very important point. I mentioned the case of the recent case about same-sex marriage in that was based on an opinion requested by the government of Costa Rica. Look, I'm not taking positions on this issue. What I'm saying is that the principle of non-interference is a very important principle for the United States and for the countries of the region. If the court starts issuing decisions on this type of issues that are of the internal competence of the countries, I think there's going to be a pushback against the Commission and the court at a time when we really need them, when we need them to monitor the violations to fundamental human rights and to political rights.
Well, look, I certainly commend Secretary Almagro. He's spoken up about the issues in Venezuela. I've spoken to him. He's been very out there, much more than previous secretaries of the OAS. And I couldn't agree with you more that they should only serve one term. Because I think what happens if they can serve, they like to cozy up to these countries, so they get reappointed. And I think that's a big problem with this organization. You have to have people there that are able to speak knowing that they don't have to run for anything else. That they're there to do a job. And quite frankly, I don't know if those changes would be made at the organization in the near future. It's just, I don't know if this organization is just like floating in the Caribbean and not getting anywhere. And there's a lot going on, all these countries. And I mean, at one point I thought that this organization should be disbanded. That's how, upset I was with the organization. But I do think that they have a role, especially when it comes to human rights. all those years that with the human rights abuses in Cuba, they never spoke up. And Cuba wasn't even a member at the time. They pulled out, and they were controlling the organization, I think, to the surrogate countries. So, sometimes when this country says, maybe we shouldn't fund these people if they don't change their ways, there's some merit to that. All right, thank you.
Mr. Yoho from Florida is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate you gentlemen being here. Being from Florida, we're obviously very connected to that part of the world and very concerned about it. What I want to know is, how do you make it better? I see OAS, and then I see the other agencies within it, the other, was it three of them, IICA, PAHO, and PAIGH. Is there a dilution of the mission statement to where you have too many people trying to accomplish the same thing, and they're not focused on one? They're all trying to reinvent the wheel. And with us paying 59.7% of the budget, the American taxpayers, I don't feel, are getting their benefit. One of the main mission statements was to promote democracy, and since 1980, and I see that failing. A lot of it's tenuous. How can we make that better if we're going to continue in this? And I take the same stance, kind of the attitude as Mr. Sears, that I think it's a very ineffective agency, and I'd like to hear what your thoughts are. And I want to come back to you, Mr. Quilter, because you said some very interesting things I need to rebut.
Okay. I think the ideas about how to make this better are out there. They've been out there for a while. The Inter-American Dialogue came out with a big report on precisely this issue today. I don't think that was an accident. I think it was timed for this hearing. I have a bunch of things in there that overlap a lot with the dialogue. The ideas are there. The issue is, does anyone feel an urgent need to try to implement these things? And that's the question mark. I really think the U.S. has a huge role to play, and they haven't done it. And by the way, that precedes the Trump administration. The U.S.'s lethargy on this issue.
I'm glad to hear that, because you brought that up. What I see is a UN-type organization in the Western Hemisphere that is as inept as the United Nations. We're putting all this money in there to promote these things, yet we see what's going on in Venezuela, and you say Venezuela is punching above their weight. And when you see what's going on in Venezuela, you've got people dying there. Children are dying because the parents don't have food in the 21st century in the Western Hemisphere. Yet I don't see people speaking out against that from the OAS and raising hell about that. And I thought you were a little bit disingenuous saying it's Trump's fault when you said there hasn't been a Secretary General there since 2014. There's plenty of blame to go around, but to blame a administration, we can blame plenty of them. And we have dropped the attention in the Western Hemisphere probably for the last 20, 25 years. We've been distracted. And, I hear the human rights things, the LGBT and, same-sex marriage. Those are important issues. But when I have babies dying in hospitals from malnutrition in Venezuela in the 21st century, those are important issues, but I think these are bigger issues that we need to deal with. And to hang everything on these social issues versus the lives of people dying, I think we need to refocus the organization's attention. What are we trying to accomplish? Are we accomplishing democracy? Democracy has been bastardized around the world because there's so many facades of democracy. People will have elections, but they're fake elections. So it's not really a democratic process that we have cherished and have experienced for 200 plus years in this country. And so to move forward, if we're going to spend 59.45% of the budget of the American taxpayers' money, I want a return for that, and I know they want a return. Again, I came up here, I've only been here for going on my 6th year, to get rid of foreign aid, and I realize we can't do that. So let's reform it to where we get the bang out of the buck that the American taxpayers expect, and that we develop these allies that are going to side with us, not side with a communist regime, not side with China, not side with Russia or Cuba. And if we're here, we need to do a better job, and I need to know what we need to do. Mr. Aguilera, or Mr. Melito, go ahead.
One positive thing I would say is there has been a commitment to improve their oversight. So in 2015, the OAS replaced its IG, which US played a very strong role in, and they endorsed it. They do have a commitment to both internal oversight and external oversight. So these are recent things which I think could hopefully be built on as the years go forward.
I just want to clarify in terms of the LGBT agenda. Look, I understand if for the commission or the court to look at, to ensure that there's no discrimination.
Right,
Obviously,
and I agree with that.
that's part of the American Convention. But my point is that the court is going, and the commission are going beyond their treaty law mandate to go into issues for which they have no mandate. Take, for example, the issue of same-sex marriage, which is very controversial. It has been controversial in this country. That's an issue for the Argentinians, for the Costa Ricans to decide through their constitutional system. When the court gets involved in an issue like that, it loses credibility at a time when it should be really focusing on issues that have to do with democracy and human rights as clearly defined in the American Convention.
Right.
So that is my concern, and that's how the commission and court, I think, at this point, are losing credibility.
Well, I see a house on fire, and I need to get my family out. I don't need to stop and water the plants before I leave. And I think we need to refocus. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Mr. Meeks from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to first welcome Mr. Quitter back. You know, he did a great job here and as on the committee, and then, of course, over at OAS, and thank all of the witnesses for their testimony. I'm listening to my colleagues who I respect and admire. I come out a little bit on the other end. I don't think that we get rid of an organization. I'm a firm believer in multilateral organizations. The UN being an example, the OAS being none. Are they perfect? I don't know anything that is perfect. I don't know any government, including mine, that is perfect. So there's room for us to improve. There's no question, to make sure that we are spending appropriately and that there is no waste. But sometimes you can do where you are cutting and you cut off your nose to spite your face, because the very things that you want to accomplish when you cut a budget so strictly, then there's nothing left and you can't accomplish anything. And I, for one, believe, as I look over history, though we have problems, and there's no question about that in places like Venezuela, democracy in Central and South America a few years ago wasn't, you know, you would name many more countries than the countries that we're naming now. There was not any, you know, democratic elections. So to me, what I see on the Western Hemisphere, but particularly in Central and South America, is thriving democracies with the exception of a few. And we should not terminate and or eliminate something because you have a few that are not doing what we want them to do. In fact, we should then figure out, you know, and understand that, you know, yes, I want to make sure that the United States is getting its bang for the money, as I said, but that does not mean that the United States can come, whether it's the UN or the OAS, and just dictate this is what is in our best interest without consideration of what some of the other nations in these multilateral organizations consider is in their best interest. And there's a dialogue and a conversation that goes along to that. And so I don't think that we're wasting our money when we are investing in the OAS. In fact, with so many elections coming up, I would like to know what the role that you see of the OAS in the coming in the pending elections that's coming up, to try to make sure that they, in the countries that have had, and even though, you know, I know Brazil and Peru, they've had problems with reference to recently, with reference to corruption, but the elections themselves, you know, so you got to make sure, and they've got elections coming up. What role will the OAS play to try to make sure that there's true democracy taking place? Mr. Quilter.
Thank you. Good to see you again, Mr. Meeks. I think the Human Rights Commission and Court are the jewels of the crown of the OAS. I think that is correct. But another thing the OAS does well, and it does some things not well, and we can talk about those, is election monitoring. And election monitoring doesn't only mean, seeing if an election is, election monitoring is a complicated thing, and the OAS has a lot of history doing it, and they do it quite well. They will be, or should be, front and center on all of these elections. Let me say something about Venezuela, because I've heard a lot about judging the OAS because the Venezuela situation has not been solved by the OAS. Let me make a comment about that. The OAS, like any multilateral organization, is a roiling cauldron of country interests, momentary circumstances, etc. For a country like the U.S., the trick is to utilize or to try to get as much done within each of these tools as it can. I actually think the OAS has done a decent amount of things on Venezuela. No, it hasn't solved Venezuela, but it has done a decent amount of things. Just yesterday, the Inter-American Commission came out with a report on Venezuela saying all the things you'd think it should say. As we know, the Secretary General has been quite vocal about Venezuela. There is, I'm going to correct you, there is a pretty decent one single resolution on Venezuela condemning Venezuela quite well in mid-2017. Perhaps that's as far as we could go as the U.S. on that issue. So you put a momentary stop on that, and you look at other issues and try and keep advancing the ball. I think that is the way to utilize these organizations.
Well, anybody else want to add? So let me just ask this question then. Do you believe, or are there other countries in the hemisphere that you think are utilizing their influence at the OAS better than the United States?
Well, yeah. I think, as I've said in my statement, I think we are leaving a vacuum. So Venezuela has now decided to withdraw from the OAS, but they have been very effective with their partners like Nicaragua, Ecuador, and Bolivia to ensure that very little happens. And it's a consensus-based system. So only a few states can band together and ensure that nothing happens, that they don't have the consensus to be able to actually pass anything that would actually have any real impact.
I'm out of time, but my next question would have been, then what should we be doing in your estimation as the U.S. to have a better bang? But I'll leave that.
Thank you very much. Maybe your colleague to the right might yield that time, but I'm not going to get involved in that. A good friend from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Cook, Ranking Member Cetus. Much has been said about the vacuum of leadership that has been left open by the United States for decades and decades. And we may think that the main beneficiary of such vacuum are countries like Venezuela, but I submit to you that I believe it's China. I think China will come in and fill that vacuum and build roads and bridges and dams and tunnels and major infrastructure projects that are necessary and critical to the economies of these countries, much like Venezuela did with Petrocaribe in the Caribbean when the oil was very expensive and could cripple the economy of those small countries. So in essence, what you see is an allegiance of those countries based on pure economic interests, very much the way we do with some countries in the Middle East where we support a dictator or a ruthless leader because they may benefit our crude political interests or economic interests there. Those countries chose to align themselves, at least temporarily, if not permanently, with troubling governments like the one in Venezuela. So we must regain the ability to invest in the region so that we could, again, fill that vacuum, and we do not yield that vacuum to a country that's already very much present there and investing heavily and bringing with it all the issues negative issues such as currency manipulation, and assault on intellectual property rights, and the rest to our hemisphere. And so I think that we're really, Almagro has been very active. In fact, he has been demonizing Venezuela and Ecuador. He's persona non grata in those countries. He has been a strong supporter of bringing democracy and stability to Venezuela. But unfortunately, he could not get the votes. We could not get the votes because we have abandoned the region in a dramatic way in the last 40, if not 60 years. So my question is to Mr. Aguilar. He has really emphasized the issue of LGBT rights and same-sex marriage. Let me remind you that same-sex marriage is already legal in Colombia, Brazil, Uruguay, Argentina, and although not entirely in Mexico, in Mexico City, as well as La Madre Patria, Spain. So I just want to ask you if you don't think that violating the high number of homicides or violent, vicious crime against gay people in those countries, or the patterns of discrimination preventing gay people from getting jobs, or any other sort of discrimination that is rampant and institutionalized in those countries, maybe because even of their religious background, if that doesn't constitute a reason for the court to have a strong decision on whether or not that is a troubling situation in those countries?
No, thank you for the question. I think it's a very valid question, and I think I was trying to make that point that those are the type of issues that the commission and the court should get involved in. When there is discrimination, harassment against people because of their sexual orientation, clearly that's a violation of the American Convention. Now, that is different from the issue of same-sex marriage. You mentioned several countries, Colombia, Argentina, Uruguay, where it is legal, and that's fine. They've gone through their political process, through their constitutional system, like the United States has, and have legalized same-sex marriage. But it's up to them. It's not for the court to make that determination for them. And this is the problem. When we've had a court just a few weeks ago come up with a decision imposing on 20 countries under the jurisdiction, some of them, most of them, who haven't legalized sex marriage, telling them, now you have to. That's for those countries to decide.
Well, I think it's very much connected. I think it is very much connected that if people of the same sex holding hands down a street are viciously beaten because they're married or killed, and there is a vicious pattern of that, I think that constitutes a very big violation of their rights. And so, Mr. Quilter, maybe you would like to add to that?
Yes, I would. I have a very, very different take on this specific issue, and that is that I'm a lawyer. It is a normal thing for a court to either be pushing on the arc of a particular issue within a society, or maybe sometimes lagging. I don't see this as a problem for the Inter-American Court at all. I think what is being said here is that it may have been impolitic or may have been out of step, but we all know that the arc of this issue bends toward more protections for the LGBT community, not less. That is where it's all going. The fact that the court is a little bit ahead of a particular country, really, that's not a reason for them not to be playing in that sandbox.
Okay, let me just conclude, Mr. Chairman, by saying that I very much feel that this current budget, as presented by President Trump, further aggravates the reliability and functionality of the OAS, and that we must move in a different direction. Thank you.
Thank you. Recognize Ms. Doris from California.
Thank you, thank you, Chairman Cook and Ranking Member Series, for holding this very important hearing. This is very definitely a timely hearing, and I agree that the OAS is very important to U.S. interest in Latin America. Sadly, over the course of the past year, we have lost a lot of influence throughout Latin America and the Caribbean. There have been a lot of missteps by this administration. Just to name a few, President Trump offended Mexico and many countries in the region. not just during the campaign, but after the campaign. He rattled our allies and played into Maduro's hand when he threatened military intervention in Venezuela. What do you think that statements like that could have an impact on our ability to advance our interests in the region and the OAS in particular? Meanwhile, his Secretary of State didn't even bother to show up at the OAS General Assembly in Cancun and missed an important opportunity to build consensus on the issue of Venezuela. So what kind of message do you think that sent? In Honduras, we have lost a lot of credibility on the issue of democracy when the State Department failed to call out an election for what it was. And if I recall correctly, it was the OAS only that stood up and said, there are certainly a lot of discrepancies, and we need to ensure that if we truly believe in democracy, that we follow our own advice. It is unfortunate that it seems to me from what I've heard today, it is democracy of convenience. I mean, we've talked a lot about many other issues, and hungry kids absolutely are a priority to me. But women being in prison simply because they have had a miscarriage is also important to me. So, of course, it doesn't help that we still, after more than a year, don't have an assistant secretary for the Western Hemisphere or an ambassador at the OAS. And now that we have a nominee for ambassador to Barbados, who is a peddler for conspiracy theories. If President Trump went to the Summit of the Americas, what kind of reception do you think that he will receive? These failures do not help advance U.S. interests in the Western Hemisphere or the OAS. I'd like to hear your comments on those three questions. Mr. Pilcher?
Thank you. There's a lot there, but I'll summits. Summits are tricky. Summits are tricky even when everybody loves you. In Cartagena, President Obama got an earful on both the U.S.'s Cuba policy and our drug policy. It was for him a bit of a disaster, even when he was riding high. What's going to happen with President Trump? I don't know. Fasten your seatbelts, I think, is the way to think about that. Tillerson in Cancun. That was malpractice. We were just a few votes away, and we know that to send in the most important guy you got is the way you close the deal, and that didn't happen. And then later they say, well, the OAS is useless because it was 2 votes short, which is a little disingenuous. Finally, Secretary Tillerson went on his recent voyage, and one of the things he was doing good stuff on Venezuela, I think, by the way, I have to give him that. But the other thing he was doing was warning that China was, the presence of China economically was spilling over into a political presence, and that was a problem. That, too, is disingenuous. What he's in fact saying is that there's a leadership vacuum in Latin America, and China is filling it. Well, whose fault is that?
Just briefly, I would say I would agree with you that Mr. Trump's comments often make it very difficult to work with our partners in the region. Having said that, it is disingenuous to think that these problems that we're facing now are just because of Mr. Trump. I think for a long time we haven't been paying attention to
I didn't say that the problems that we are facing in Latin America are solely the fault of the current president. I did say that the lack of leadership currently in this administration has actually made things worse in the region.
I agree.
Don't misquote me.
Well, it wasn't my intention. But there was certainly, I would argue, a lack of leadership under the Obama administration at the OAS.
The Obama administration is not currently in a position to make a change. So
no, but I think
moving forward, Mr. Aguilar, I'd like for you to speak on current issues.
I think
and current time frame today.
I appreciate your point, but I think it's good when we look at Latin America to look at the historical perspective, just to ensure that we're objective and we can make some sound
Historical
comments.
perspective doesn't help unless you're talking about when you're referring to Latinos that look like me as drug dealers and drug pushers and prostitutes.
I've never
My
agreed
time
with...
is up and I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Smith is recognized from New Jersey.
Chairman, First of all, I'm sorry I was late. I was chairing my own hearing on China that ran overboard, especially with the witnesses. But I just want to thank our witnesses. I'm sorry I missed it all, but I will go back and look at the record. I have worked on human rights. I've been in Congress 38 years, and frankly, we have had, under many administrations, a lack of focus on human rights. I was in Bolivia, joined by Nidia Velázquez against Evo Morales. And frankly, the last administration did nothing to help this American named Jacob Ostreicher, who was being held in Palomacero prison. I went to Palomacero prison twice, went to the court hearings, and our embassy would not help him. I even asked them a question, if Jacob Ostreicher, an American from New York, and I'm not from New York, I'm from New Jersey, like my good friend Albio Sears, and Albio was very helpful on that as well, would you at least provide him asylum, an American within our own embassy? And they told me no. I couldn't believe it. I held 4 congressional hearings on it. So there was a lack of focus on Bolivia. There was a lack of focus on Venezuela. And when it came to Cuba, how many hearings do we have on Cuba, Albio? One after the other after the other. There was no sense of wanting to extradite a cop killer who continues to run free. We said there ought to be conditionality before things, the rapprochement with Cuba occurs. Say, these are the non-negotiables that we have to have, and none of that happened. And what got me into Cuba years ago was Armando Valladares' book, Against All Hope, which exposed the facade of what's going on in Cuba, and it continues to this day, of political prisoners who are tortured. I have tried for 25 years to get into Cuba. I tried recently going down to the embassy, and I said, I'd like to go to Cuba. I'd like to be with different dissidents. And you know what I was told? We tell you who you can't see. And I said, do American members of Congress agree to that? And they told me yes. That's the ambassador. Piero Tozzi and I went down there with the hope of going in, okay, if there is a changed attitude in Cuba, well, let's test it. And I can't get a visa to go to Cuba. There's 4 places where I couldn't get a visa. One, I just got changed. Russia is one. The other is Cuba. And the other 2 have switched, and I've been able to go to China and to Belarus, where I've worked on human rights issues as well. So again, I want to thank the chairman for having this hearing. The OAS could do far more in holding people to account, in my humble opinion. And Albio Sears and I have worked for so long on Cuban human rights, which have always been in the back bench, always been, an afterthought on the part, particularly of the last administration. So, Cuba was taken off and I'll just end with this, the Tier 3 listing for traffickers. They were on there because of labor trafficking abuses, which they claim don't happen, and because of their feckless response on sex trafficking. I'm the author of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2004, 2 reauthorizations and another, but all focused on human trafficking. There was nothing in the behavior of the Cuban dictatorship that warranted an upgrade except a belief by the last administration that, if we just act nice and take them off, human rights have to be, whoever is authoritarian, left or right, who cares? If they commit human rights abuse and you're being tortured, or in this case being trafficked, it doesn't matter what style of dictatorship you're dealing with. And they gave them an artificial upgrade, which I denounced, did press conference on it, nobody covered it, and I find that to be appalling. Unfortunately, they're still on the upgraded list. This administration did not change that. I have appealed to the administration to do so in their new TIP report when it comes out on or about mid-June, because the situation there is awful. Then what they've done to our embassy personnel is off the scales in terms of diplomatic breaches. So again, I want to thank all of you for your testimony. And Chairman, I thank you. I'm sorry I didn't get into the full flow of the hearing, but I was doing my own. I apologize.
Well, I want to thank you very much. I was going to ask a couple of final questions, but I just want to make a comment that obviously I think we need another follow-up here, not because some of the issues here are, we kind of skirted around them, but I think we've got to break it down in some of these different aspects of it. Yeah, I think the Organization of American States got some problems. And how we're going to fix it, we're not going to fix it today for a variety of reasons. And contrary to some of the other testimony, I'm one of those ones that think you have to bring the states together. You're not always going to agree. It's tough. It's tough doing this stuff. And, you know, I probably said it in here, you know, Bismarck said, making good policy is like watching them make sausages. It's not very much fun, but it's something you have to do. And when you have a lot of different countries and you have a lot of different people, and I think a lot of it is everybody has enough blame to go around. But I'm optimistic that we're finally looking south. We're looking at our neighbors. I think they've been ignored far too long. You know, the money issue, I think reflects the fact that a lot of people don't understand how critical the area is or how critical some of the issues that we address. And each and every person here has probably got an axe to grind or they get excited about it. And that passion, I think, warrants another hearing on how we can do it. I don't know whether you gentlemen would agree with that bottom line that I'm taking away, but we kind of scratched the surface here. And maybe we can build on that. We gotta, and maybe our agenda be more inclusive on maybe suggestions or questions on how we can repair this, including many of the issues that were raised today. So my guidance to everybody based upon what we learned today is maybe we can go forth and find out certain things and how we can propose and maybe fix it in our own committee. So with that, this meeting is now adjourned. Thank you very much for your patience.